Hey everybody, welcome to part of my interview series with David Goodrich, a veteran game designer whose work spans nearly 3 decades across series such as Ratchet and Clank's PSP games, Twisted Metal, Vigilante 8, True Crime, and much more. If you're watching chronologically, this is part 2 of our nearly 4-hour chat, which covers the bulk of David's time at high impact games, specifically his time on Ratchet and Clank Size Matters as a senior designer and his time as Secret Agent Clank's lead designer. It spans his work on the former game's multiplayer, which had several unique elements, such as the wildly unique Iron Lombax mode, where the objectives would change completely depending on the map you were playing on. From there, it dives into his time working on the game's single-player story as his role at the company evolved, with a ton of fun behind-the-scenes details, before concluding with the crunchy state of Secret Agent Clank's development, and how much of that game was dictated by the studio's increasingly tight timelines and budget struggles. There's also a bit of info about High Impact's cancelled Oddities project with Microsoft, a platformer inspired by Psychonauts whose cancellation led to several key members departing the company, and a game for which details have pretty much never been shared. Shortly after, or around the time of True Crime, would have been around when you jumped to High Impact, if I have the timeline sort of correct. There's
Yeah,
probably a gap in there somewhere.
yeah, there actually not much of a gap,
Okay.
about a week. So we launched True Crime, and the numbers were not moving like Activision wanted at the time. So this is when I started to see a lot of bloat in video games that you're hearing about today, where all of a sudden we had like, and I'm paraphrasing here because I don't remember the exact number, but it was a ridiculous number. We had like a $50 million marketing budget, and then we
Yeah.
had to accommodate for all the songs for all the artists we put in there, and a bunch of other factors with like VO actors and stunt guys and stuff like that. So Activision felt that True Crime 2 was going to be such an enormous hit because number one was, but number one was a smaller team and smaller budgets,
Yeah.
so they overspent on it, on everything outside of pure development. So it swelled the budget quite a bit. And when they looked at the numbers and how much they needed to make, they made a determination of like, we need to shut down Luxo. Like, sorry guys.
Yeah.
Um, so they did big layoffs. They laid off the core team, and a lot of people there. They kept on a very skeletal team that was then run by one of the Activision guys to kind of limp along, making I think a Transformer game and something like that, until Luxo eventually shut down like a year later, and all those guys went off to Treyarch. So after those layoffs, again, I used my contacts with some of the early Insom guys, and then found my way into High Impact Games, where fortunately the layoff was not long. So I think it
Yeah.
was exactly a week.
Okay.
Interviewed with them, did really well. They only wanted me to come on and just do the multiplayer section of Ratchet and Clank. I presented some initial maps, that I learned during my my Black Ops days, right? Figuring out how to do level design and stuff. And from there, joined that company, um, doing a lot of their multiplayer, and then figuring out things like Iron Lombax and Capture the Flag, and building a bunch of multiplayer modes and extra bells and whistles in there. Again, with a very small team, there was only three of us working on the multiplayer. There was me, an artist, and a programmer,
That's
and then
wild.
I would do other duties on that project too, because we wrapped up pretty quickly and early on that. So I ended up like doing the Mungo boss. I created all the base abilities for the armor system. Um, I think we had initially the wildfire was done, but all the others had um, no particular ability set to them. So I went through and did all of that for the base armor sets.
Yeah.
And then one of the programmers who was really green and really new guy to the industry, it was Ron Lefree. Really good programmer, really good design sense. He pointed out to me like, "Hey, as you're going through the game, if you have this full set of armor, but you find a better helmet with better armor resistance on it, it's gonna break the chain. Like you're not gonna have that armor ability anymore." And I'm just like, well, then we're gonna have to come up with a whole mix and match system, and I don't have time for that because I'm now moving on to like the weapon systems and building out the mods and upgrades on all the weapons. And I told him, like, "If you wanna do it, go for it. Like, I'm not your boss. I'm not gonna stop you." And he stayed for, like, I have to look at his blog, but I wanna say,
Yeah.
like, 2 to 3 days
I
straight
think he said
programming.
72 hours straight, if I remember that blog correctly.
He did
Um,
not leave the office for, like, 72
yeah.
hours, um, making all the mix and match abilities for the armor systems, which is just it blew my mind when he did that. And I guess when Roberto found out that he had been crunching like that, he just sent him home
Yeah,
immediately.
yeah. Which goes into what you were saying earlier with regard to crunch. High Impact's founding idea was to do, for example, something like a Ratchet and Clank on their own terms in the way that they envisioned, without
Mhm.
having the crunch that came at Insomniac at the time. And that vision, from what I've ever understood, was never realized. It was pretty crunchy just about the whole way until probably near the end of that studio when it was on the way to shutting down in 2012, around 2012.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I mean, Ratchet& Clank Size Matters was not as crunchy as
Mhm.
the 2 following
Yeah.
projects, but it was still pretty crunchy. There were days where I was there till 2 in the morning, um, and I would go home because we were catching a flight at 7 in the morning to head up to Sony to do play tests, and some of my bosses got very mad that I left, and I was just like, "I would like to go home and
Sleep a
get
little.
2 hours of sleep,
Yeah.
take a shower before I spend all day at Sony." That definitely happened a couple of times there. Um, and I will say, to be fair, in this particular instance, like Ron doing all those extra, that 72-hour shift, that was, I hate to say it, the good type of crunch, because you are putting this upon yourself to realize a creative idea, to
Yeah.
see it, come to fruition. I have done that many times where just like, I want to finish this. Oh, it didn't work out the way I wanted. Okay, let me tune it, let me tweak it. Next thing you know, I look up, it's like 4 in the morning. As
That
opposed to True Crime, which unfortunately was like a death march
yeah.
where, you know, you have an Activision exec or someone high up in the organization hanging out in the studio, making sure everybody stays there until 10.
That's
You
wild.
know,
To have like an actual uh
not an exec, but one of their people,
somebody.
yes,
Yeah.
that was merged into Luxoflux.
And I
You know,
was gonna say, like, even I was gonna jump in and say the same thing with regard to the more impassioned type of crunch, because that is just a fact of anything creative at a point.
mhm.
Like, obviously Hollywood exempt because they have actual regulations against a lot of that stuff, because they've had more time to learn those lessons. But even like, I can speak personally, when I was in, high school and college, doing individual, tiny game projects with a couple friends for the sake of a project, I would be up till 2 a.m. just trying to get one stupid thing right, because, especially you're banging your head against the keyboard, but you want to make it work. And like, that's just how it is with anything. I've done it with videos. Anyone who's done content can tell you that that's a thing you do. You work a 16-hour day sometimes for the sake of getting it the way you want to.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the video game industry it's a passion industry,
Yeah.
and that's what made a lot of those games really great, especially back in the day. Like, it was a lot of it was self-inflicted crunch, crunch. Obviously, you're going to tire out and then go home if it's on your own terms.
Mhm.
Um, Enforced crunch, it's effective for about 2 weeks, and then you start to see serious diminished returns
Yeah.
because people are losing sleep and you're introducing more bugs and more issues into the game they're actually fixing. And you know that is where I kind of start to have the issue, is when it starts to extend
Yeah.
beyond that, because then it is a detriment to the game and not an actual boon.
Yeah. I tend to delineate between crunch and crunch culture, when I'm talking about this sort
Mhm.
of thing, from my, fake historian lens, because, like, there are examples of a full studio doing crunch without it being a crunch culture sort of thing.
Mhm.
The example I would give is, God of War 2 was a fascinating one, because it was a team that was being functionally led by the the junior managers of the prior project, who all had to step up in unison to fill the gaps that existed. And it was this, according to everyone who's ever spoken about it, like, yeah, there was crunch, it was rough, and people got snippy, but it was, we want to prove that we can do it, sort of
Mhm.
sort of thing. And it's
Yeah.
one of the only examples that I've found of that sort of good crunch being a studio wide thing, or stretching beyond an individual, like, I want to add my thing to the game. Well, first off, let's talk about the multiplayer a little bit because, again, I'm not incredibly familiar with the multiplayer. That's one of my blind spots with Ratchet. Do you want to walk through and explain like some of your thought processes on designing like Iron Lombax, or how that came together collaboratively, or anything in that vein, really?
Sure. Yeah, not a lot of people know about the multiplayer version of it, but I mean, they can always check out the Discord
Yep.
and look at that. I had actually kind of forgotten about it a little bit until I saw it recently, surprisingly. But I, when I got this task to make the multiplayer for Size Matters, I had all these big plans of like we're gonna have 12v12 or 6v6, running around fighting each other. Um, but a lot of the people that we had on Size Matters initially, this was their first job. Like they were fresh out of college.
Yeah.
It's so they didn't have a lot of the experience or know-how. So as the game was progressing, the versus number kept going down and down and down until it was 2v2. So I had to readjust the maps to kind of fit for that team size. But while I was doing that too, I just didn't want to do the standard, capture the flag or deathmatch, even though they are incorporated in there.
Yeah.
So I wanted to do things like 3v1, and then I kind of got the idea for new modes in that called Iron Lombax, where everybody does different tasks in order to succeed outside of just killing, kill or be killed
Yeah.
or get a flag back to the base. So one of the modes I came up with was it was called Island Escape, and you're supposed to run around and collect fuel cells at this one bin at the end of the map, and then people could fight over it or grab one and run, and then slowly power up different sections that lead to a ship, and then whoever got their ship fully powered and into it would take off and leave the island, and then they would win regardless of what the kill count was. So that one, looking back, I actually think was one of the first shooter extraction modes that
I
was
was gonna
made
say
for
the same
games.
thing. Like that might be the earliest example that I can think of, because, or even of like a hybrid objective based mode, because obviously this would be '07, so Counter Strike existed around '06. I forget,
Yeah, we might
but
have squeaked in there.
it was around the same time as that. But I can't think of anything that had like a. I'm thinking of like Halo Reach Invasion, or Battlefield, the later
Mhm.
Battlefields with the Rush, like changing objectives throughout the process of a mission is something that Size Matters is one of the first to do, if not the.
Yeah, I think so. I've tried to look into some things I thought we did first on this
Mhm.
project, but it's so hard to research stuff that far back.
Yeah.
One of the things I added that I'm still not 100% sure about, but I think I created the first Nemesis mode in video games. At least Ron LaFree thinks so, where if somebody kills you more than anybody else in a versus death match, you will see devil horns above their head. From there, I kind of riffed off into whoever it has the highest kill count has a crown above their head, and I
Mhm.
think this also might be the first time to do that. But I,
That
in my searches, I couldn't find.
I feel like
So
with the Nemesis thing, you might know, or if not, comments might know. I feel like Gears of War had a similar thing in '06.
'06
So they
could have
might have
been.
just squeaked you out by a smidge.
I will
On
say I never played Gears of War,
Okay,
so
gotcha. I feel like I remember that being a thing, that if they killed you a couple times, there was like a payback system that you could get. But I could be
yeah,
completely, that could be Gears of War 2 for all I know, in which case you beat him to it.
it could be. I like all of this is unconfirmed,
Yeah.
but just looking back and talking to like some of the people on the Discord and
Mhm.
stuff, it seems like if the first, if not one of the first, we'll
Yeah.
say one of the first, just to be on the safe side.
What I might be thinking of is Halo 3 onward had the payback medal, where if you killed
Mhm.
someone who killed you a few times in a row, you would get like a payback. It was like when they would say double kill, for example, there'd be a payback one.
Right.
So, but that was also '07. Like what I was gonna say was that this was also its own Wild West at this point,
Yeah.
because console and handheld online especially did not it wasn't a thing properly yet, or it had just started in 04 ish with the Xbox and '05 on PS2, but it was so limited that like even with Ratchet 3, they there was no infrastructure for Sony's online, so they worked in patches into the end user license agreement. They would sneak in like the edge, like top and bottom pieces of the end user license agreement. They could like sneak in code to patch things, which is a fascinating one. With it's all interesting. You mentioned player
Yeah.
count. Were there functional builds then that existed beyond concept of higher player counts of multiplayer?
Yeah, so somebody found in the code that we had up to 3v3,
Okay.
but it was commented out. We tried higher tests, but the programmer on the project was so new that he hadn't done a lot of networking,
Yeah.
and you know the the PSP had significant limitations
Uh,
as far as that went.
yeah.
So I wish with the new community getting this thing on emulator, we could up that count somehow and test that out. But yeah, it was PlayStation limitations and experience limitations, I think,
I
for me.
figured it was more so the PSP's limitations. I never anticipated that there'd be higher than a 2v2 for that reason, because even the PS2 games only had 4v4.
Yeah.
That's an
I
interesting
forget
one.
the exact reasons, but like we had 3v3 working at one point, and I think it just caused more bugs
Mhm.
and more packet loss or something along those lines.
Yeah.
I'm
It
not the most technical, so I'm throwing out jargon I hear all the
No, no, no,
time.
I get you. I There's somebody I know that does modding stuff with Ratchet 1, that
Mm,
if there was anybody that I knew in the modding scene that'd be capable of expanding the PSP like via emulation, the multiplayer, it would be him. So I might
hmm,
try and send him your way to that Discord, because I don't know, he's not probably familiar with like that code base at all, but he has a
yeah,
Ratchet 1 multiplayer mod that exists.
yeah, that's
Which
interesting.
it's not like a death match or anything, but it's like you can like race, that kind of thing. Um
But yeah, so
anyway, yeah.
I'll circle back to the other, Iron Lombax modes
Yeah,
real
yeah.
quick. I do have a funny story about the Island Escape one. So we had a very talented artist, or animator, I should say, named Dasip, who his English was not the best at the time. So before I had joined, the Mungo boss in there, someone asked for an animation where Mungo blows up, and they managed to like blow him up into pieces and die. He animated blowing up like a balloon
Yeah.
instead.
That's what I figured you were
Yeah.
going with. Wow.
So that when we were trying to like grab art, because there was only 3 people making the multiplayer,
Yeah.
we're looking for all the spare art everywhere, and I found this animation, and I was like, I got this idea of like, huh, if you carry a fuel cell too long, we have a radiation meter that builds up, and then when it hits max, um, it turns you into Mungo, like a small green version of Mungo, and you can go around and shoot all of them. But I got the idea of like, what if you use the mutator on them? And instead of turning them into a cow, we just use that inflate animation and just have them just go off into outer space at that point. So I was able to reuse all these little bits
That's
and
so
pieces in
cool.
kind of creative ways.
That's so neat.
Some of the other modes in Iron Lombax that I wanted to do something new with is you have a level where you're trying to destroy the enemy team's base, and you have to run around getting a tracking device that you strap onto yourself. And as you run around the level, hover mines appear, and they start chasing the people with the tracking device on them, and they have to run it to the enemy base and attach it. And you have to do that several times in order to destroy their base, in order to win the game. So it's another one of these. You don't have to kill everybody to win. You just
Yeah.
have to be able to do this, and you can kill people, take their tracking device, run it back to their base instead. That worked out really well. Another level that I thought was really funny is called Moon Cow Disease, and
Yes.
you are a hot dog restaurant or a hamburger restaurant, and you are running around trying to collect meat crates and put them onto your delivery truck to send it out. And you got to send out, I think, 3 of those.
Yeah.
And you're running around stealing each other's meat crates, and trying to get them onto the truck. But you can also use the mutator to turn an enemy into a meat crate and then run them to the meat packing truck and
It
send them off. which always cracks me up.
Every time, like I said, I've never been able to like set it up and play with actual humans. So I've just kind of run around and like played the multiplayer stuff alone for like,
Mhm.
B-roll or just out of curiosity. But every time I've heard anything about the multiplayer modes, I think they're some of the most creative things that the series has had in terms of utilizing weapons in a unique way. And man, if there had been an audience for Ratchet multiplayer, like when they tried that Full Frontal Assault, the PS3 game,
Mhm.
it would have been so cool to see some super unique, like just that era of multiplayer that doesn't really exist anymore because now it's all very homogenized. Um,
Yeah.
not to be, the old times were better, but I have a friend who's has said many times, I liked it back when multiplayer only needed to be a thing for a month. You'd have I liked tacked on multiplayer is the thing he says. And it's like, yeah, like that's exactly it. Like those were the most creative ones. They were so cool.
Yeah. It was a good time. I was really impressed with what we did with just 3 people too, building out the Iron
Yeah,
Rombax
seriously.
and all the other modes. Mega cannons was also another one that's a lot of fun where you can run around and pick up gears to rebuild a giant cannon in your base, and then you have to power it up by grind railing down the various power conduits and then flipping switches to send power to your base. And if you want, you can get in the cannon and then shoot at people with this giant mega cannon that like fires a sun at them.
Oh, it's so cool.
Um, or just win the match by blowing up their mega cannon. But like one of the things I forgot about is you can run up to an enemy's cannon and start beating it with your wrench to pull the gears back off, and then use a polarizer to like move them around the
Yeah.
environment. Um, Things like that were really neat, and we even had like a cut level. Oh, this is actually kind of interesting for SAC. We were going to have a spaceship graveyard multiplayer map level, and it was going to be a big one for more people. But with time running out and everything, it got cut. That became the kudzu level for um,
No
Quark's
way.
gameplay in Secret
Yeah.
Agent Clank. That was going to be a giant multiplayer map. Running around, you would get a treasure
Yeah.
map which would reveal treasures, and you would pick up these treasures because you were like space pirates, and then you would run them back to a vault to bank them. But if you were killed before you got back to the vault, people could take that treasure and run it to their vault. And then once you hit like a certain money threshold, you'd won that match.
That's so interesting. Like now that you say it, I can envision that being like because there are maps in Deadlock that feel kind of similar because they're like all, a lot of bottomless pits, a lot of like narrow walkways, that sort of thing that like I've seen in Ratchet maps in multiplayer before. So that like now that you say it, I can't unsee it. That's so
That's good.
cool. That's so cool.
Was there a fourth map? Am I forgetting a fourth map in Size Matters?
I
Mega cannons, hover mines, moo cow disease.
think it was the first one that we talked about prior. Because there's the shoot, what is
Oh
it?
my. I
The
know. My
Mungo.
brain.
The no, we already you said that one.
Oh, that was yeah, that was yeah, sorry. Mega cannons, island escape, moon cow disease, hover mines. Yeah, that was it. That was all
Okay.
four. So
Okay.
I think we covered up
Yeah, because we had hit that one
including
before.
the
Um,
including the infamous secret level with it's now kudzu with all those hidden cards, or one of the hidden cards in the middle of it where you have to jump off the eyeball and like into
as
fake
very
space to get
specific
there.
spot. That's that one's my
I
favorite
think
part
I
of
know who
that.
did that.
I don't know who figured it out first, but my favorite part is that that's specifically once you get everything, the reward for those that aren't familiar. When you do New Game Plus and Secret Agent Clank, there are three key cards hidden that are a bonus secret area inside the treehouse, developer level. And if you get all of them, you then get access to a special gadget called the Chalice of Power.
Chalice of Dallas, was it?
Dallas's Chalice of Power, I think is what it
Dallas,
was.
yes.
And
Dallas.
that specifically, when you get that, they say you looked up how to get this, didn't you? Uh, which is even funnier because then there's still also a secret code you need to do to actually activate it. It's not a weapon, like it's not on your inventory at all. It doesn't even show up in the menu. So you need to do like a Konami code type thing to use it. And my hunch has just been that that was already in like the Prima Games thing, or that somebody on the development team was like, I'm just gonna post this on a forum somewhere and let it go at a point.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, I forget where the code came from, but Dallas's Chalice. Dallas was a very eccentric artist on our team, let's say, and I think during Halloween he went to like one of the Halloween stores and found a giant plastic gold jeweled chalice that he kept on his desk, and he called it the pimp chalice or something. And that is where that thing came from, because everybody would walk
Okay.
by and just be like, "This thing's ridiculous," and somebody just said, "We have to put this in the game as a secret," and that's where that came from.
I'm glad you brought that up because I didn't even think to ask about that. I had just always assumed that that was there's a character in Ratchet Deadlock named Dallas, so I just assumed that that was like a reference to that character for some reason. I don't know why. I never put two and two together. That why would that be a reference? You know,
I could
when
see why you came to that, but
yeah,
yeah, no, it was Alice was the name of the artist.
that makes sense. That makes sense. But that's probably one of the deepest cut like hidden collectibles because it's so out of the way to get. Like that's very like old Nintendo type secret to get to that point.
Yeah, it's crazy. We put a lot of interesting things in the treehouse. I think in the sack treehouse, you can see a picture of me. It's like a on one of the
The desks or
on
whatever.
one of the bookshelves.
Yeah.
Um, I didn't want much of a presence there for the like. I was burnt out on the game.
Don't put me in this shit.
I was like, I gotta hide it in my credits. It's really funny. Like, I didn't want to put it on my credits because it was so poorly received and just
Yeah.
bashed by the Ratchet community. Same with Small Brawl, but here we are like 15, 20 years later, depending on the game, and there's like a fan base, like a rabid fan base for
Ev-
some of this stuff.
Every game is somebody's favorite. That's the coolest thing about
Yeah,
this whole field is that no matter what, something's going to be someone's favorite or someone's first. Like I've
yeah.
joked to my friends that there's a Roblox Sonic game that came out around the time of the first movie, and that's going to introduce more people to Sonic than any Sonic game ever has because it's in
Mhm.
Roblox. So, of
Yeah, that's true. Oh, one last thing I just kind
course,
of throw
of
out there.
course,
I've been talking in a lot of like me's and I's during this, but like, when I'm talking about like weapon design and level design, everybody had a say in it. I just don't want to name names,
of
just in
course,
case they're uncomfortable with me doing that, even
sure,
though I've already kind of done that. But I figure the ones I have talked about so far have blogs or are kind of on the internet in some way. So, I can skirt that a little bit. But I don't want to make it seem like I did all the weapon mods by myself. Like that's no. Like I come up with ideas. I'm a designer. Programmers throw in their input. Goes back and forth. Sometimes, occasionally Sony, but not really. So it is generally a team effort when we're building even the smallest components of this stuff.
yeah, yeah. I think anyone and anyone who's watching this who follows the channel and isn't just finding this, via an algorithm, knows that a lot of what I've covered has always been in that same vein. As it's always a team effort. There's not just one person. You can't
Hmm.
pin it on one person. Even down to there is a controversy at Insomniac with the most recent Ratchet game, where someone on the team went to GDC and was talking about, yeah, we did this. I don't remember who it was specifically, but one of us came up with this idea, and a former employee got very upset at that and
Hmm.
made it a public thing, only to be corrected that they didn't come up with the thing in question anyway. So there was a fun Twitter back and forth about that right in the middle of Insomniac having a bunch of weird press about Spider-Man and dumb Twitter things mostly.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it's never just one person. So thankfully, I think that if folks are watching this, I'm assuming this part is going to end up being like 2 hours into this podcast. Uh,
Right. Unless that part sucked, then it wasn't me.
Everything good is the stuff that I did.
I've made plenty of bad decisions over the time, and so has everybody else on the team. So,
Yeah.
I mean, it is what it
No
is.
one bats 1,000 ever on anything. To jump ahead on size matters, I'm curious what input you had, or if you had any directly on the PS2 port, because that was done internally uh, at the same time as other things that were going on that we'll talk about, or semi.
Yeah, not really. Size Matters did pretty good. So Sony wanted to kind of capitalize on it and make a PS2 version and to do it on the cheap. But the team was pretty much already off on Secret Agent Clank at that
Okay.
point. So I think we spared a programmer or two to go down and port that thing. Like they were porting it down in the basement, which is one of the reasons why I think the multiplayer got cut was because it was too much work for such a small, conversion team down there. So they just pulled that all together and
Mhm.
fixed the camera using the sticks, which we obviously didn't have with
Yeah,
PSP version, and that's where those efforts went.
that
But
makes sense.
I will never forgive them for cutting my multiplayer because I had some really good stuff in there.
I had anticipated it was a similar issue because either it was that combined with any functional online issues that would come with just wholesale rebuilding or porting that system to the PS2's different infrastructure for
Mm.
its networking, which also didn't really exist anyway at that point. Um, and you'd have to expand it to beyond 2v2 if possible for the sake of trying to get matches. So it's not a surprise it was cut. I know um, Richard Lafleur, uh,
Yeah.
he
Oh,
had a comment, and this is one thing I'm going to put in the PS2 section of that Ratchet compilation video, where I'm guessing he was one of the ones that had a hand, at least partly, in that version, because he mentioned that somebody at Sony came to him and said, "Why is the wrench hitting the hill?" Because you would throw your wrench and it would hit the hill, and it's supposed to
mhm.
track up the hill, and that was something that he had to fix without going over the 2 lines of code already dedicated, like, because the game was, like, locked at that point. And so it was, like,
Right.
a few weeks to fix that, or a few days to fix that, while doing, like, the most, mastermind 2 lines of code you could think of to fix that one thing that one random Sony rep was like, "You have to fix it or else." That's an interesting
Yeah.
one.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I think we had Ron and Travis, and I
I'm sorry,
maybe
Ron, not
another.
Richard. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Um, so, to jump back, broadly, did you folks have any direct input or communications with Insomniac given how High Impact was founded and how Sony then came to you guys for a Ratchet contract despite the circumstances of High Impact being founded?
Right. This was before my time.
Okay.
I do remember there was some tension between High Impact and Insomniac, so that sounds like that would jive.
Yeah.
I don't know, but it does sound like it would be in line with some of the
Yeah.
stuff I've heard.
There were definitely
Um,
interviews as well with Leslie, who I haven't spoken with her either on this stuff, but some of her interviews were interesting because there was a lot of games press at the time would try and ask like, "Oh, so do you guys talk to Insomniac frequently?" And then she would try and like answer pretty curtly like, "We're doing our thing," And there was you could dig underneath that and see because like they would keep digging and she'd be like, "No, like we don't really talk to them." Like,
yeah.
yeah,
Leslie's still a good friend of mine. I've worked with her at a couple more places after High Impact Games, so
yeah.
I will not speak ill of
No,
her.
no, I'm not, and of course not. It was just
But
an interesting one because you could tell that they were putting her
yeah,
in a position on those interview questions, and she was trying to.
yeah, something definitely went on there,
Yeah,
for sure. And the fact that Sony was in the middle, courting both of these groups was also interesting, even
that's
though
what
they were.
exactly. That's what was most fascinating to me is that Sony still came to them because it was always understood. Everyone said in games press at the time, "Oh, High Impact was founded by X Insomniac and Naughty Dog staff," and like that's true,
Mhm.
but
I
like
don't know who the or the Naughty Dog guy was.
there were only one or two, I think, and I think they came in with Jack Lost Frontier, so it kind of got changed over time to be both.
There was
Really?
not. I
Oh,
don't think there was a single. I'd have to look back, but Jack was the third one in our installment, and I've been
yeah.
hearing it was founded by Insomniac and Naughty Dog, but that would have been Ratchet 1 if it was founding. So I don't think we ever had a
It's
Naughty Dog in there.
that's interesting. That's one of those, another telephone game story then.
I think it came in about halfway through Size Matters.
Okay.
So there was probably a lot that happened up to that point that I'm not aware of.
Yeah, yeah. Because they
But
were founded in '04, so they technically, I mean, end of '04, so they had, like, another, they had all of '05 into '06 to have started
mm,
prototyping and getting contracts together and all that stuff.
yeah. I do know that one of the things that got us the contract was the amount of particles we could push on the PlayStation because
Mhm.
Sony was really interested, at least back in the day, they were more interested in showing off the tech and what it could do than the actual game itself.
Yep,
It was just a bonus if they could get a good game on there
yep.
too at the same time.
It that was an interesting that led to a lot of the issues that Sony had with the Vita. Um, Interestingly down the road, that's a longer story that I won't get into,
Yeah.
but, it
Yeah.
was related to, Shuhei Yoshida's,
Yep.
ever-changing responsibilities there and having so much on his plate that the Vita actually from what I understand it, the Vita part of the reason that it ended up so dire, beyond just being too powerful and too expensive for a handheld in 2013, was that he never actually got around to negotiating with third parties or any studios to make games on it because he was
Mhm.
so busy trying to fix the PS3 and like fix Japan Studio because Japan Studio was doing its whole own thing with literally 40 plus games that never came out.
Yeah, I met Shuhei a couple times and Alan Becker back in the day. So both really nice guys. He was a super laid back guy that nothing bothered him.
Mhm.
And I find out years later on like one of Jaffe's stream that he was a major pothead. It was just like, oh,
that
this all makes
that
sense
explains it.
now.
It's interesting because like there were articles that different game journalists had written about Japan Studio and about like when he first got there, when because he was born in Japan, moved to America, half Japanese, half
Mhm.
American, and he went back when they asked him to take over for Shuhei because they needed someone to work on the Vita, so Shuhei worked on the Vita, and it was just they needed a sea change, and he did the thing that all managers are supposed to do when they come to a new place, and he stayed for like 4 months and didn't do anything, didn't change a single thing, just watched. And that was the moment that I was like, I need to find out how to email this guy and like interview him because that's something that you don't see in the games industry is somebody who follows management practices. Um,
Yeah.
but
No,
anyway,
we have such I mean, we have such high turnover in the game
oh god,
industry that all this knowledge is lost constantly. So it is refreshing to see some people do some of the old school stuff to help build this.
mhm,
But
of
every company I go to where we get like a whole new crop of kids, I'm going to use that word.
course,
I watch them making the same mistakes over and over again that were solved like 10, 15,
yeah,
20 years ago. And, it's, you try to help them out and it's just like, they have like a I know better attitude because I went to a
I
game
went to
design
school for
school
it,
and
yeah,
it's just like,
yeah,
guess what? I taught at that school.
yeah,
Like, you can listen to me.
yeah,
Kind of going back to like Sony courting both High Impact and Ensom. If that rumor is true that Insomniac did not want to make a PSP game, I
that I can confirm
tot-
that is true.
I totally get the fact that they helped and courted Hig doing it because they really needed some strong titles to launch this new platform and
Yeah,
make it successful. So if Insomniac doesn't want to do it, they don't get to complain about it.
yeah.
Like, sorry, like either run with the torch or pass it, and like those are your options here.
And from what I understand, because I know they've been on record even saying we're not working on anything handheld. Multiple times people had asked them, and their official company line was we're not working on handheld stuff. So that's straight up true. Um,
Yeah.
but it's so interesting because with how Insomniac early on when High Impact existed treated the High Impact games as far as their canonicity to the series. Uh, I'm not sure if you guys had any conversations about that sort of thing because I know a lot of stuff at the time people didn't really care as much whether it
Yeah.
mattered or not. But I know it took until 10 years after Secret Agent Clank for them to say, "Oh, that's an episode of the show." Uh, like that, and which, mind you, that can't happen. Like if you want Ratchet nerd stuff, that doesn't align. Like it doesn't work unless they also mean that size matters happened in the real series, and then they
Yeah.
based an episode of the show on what happened in real. Like it's a whole thing. Like it's stupid, but um, do you have any
Yeah.
memories of that sort of conversation about how it was treated by Insomniac after release?
I mean, I heard from like Leslie and some of the others that you know they were not thrilled with some of the early builds that we gave them,
Hmm.
and they weren't happy about that. But as far as like how Secret Agent Clank came about, like there was that was it two or three where they have
Three
that Clank
had the
three
movie
where he
character.
is
Yeah.
doing a TV character, and that was the whole basis of Secret Agent Clank.
Yeah.
But we then wanted to twist it into like, well, what if this was actually real?
Yeah.
And the TV series is just his cover for him
Or
being a
actually
real
being a
secret
secret
agent.
agent. That's
And
my
that
that's
was
my
like,
favorite bit about that game. It's such a fun, like, dumb little thing that I'm just like, I love that implication. Like, as much as I jokingly criticize it, it's so funny.
yeah, it was a fun project to work on, but that's when crunch really was starting to kind of ramp up, and it was mainly because High Impact Game was starting to kind of court other developers, and they were looking at Microsoft, and they were spinning up a game called Oddities. So literally, the team got cut in half, and I got thrust into a lead design position on SAC because I guess I was the growing up on the team at that point. Because I had a few titles under my belt, and I don't think not a lot of other people did
Yeah.
at that, you know. So that mantle kind of fell on me. So I leaned heavily into like looking at the old James Bond movies and Get Smart and just pulling gags from that, and then helping to kind of flesh out and write out the storyline around that as best I could, with Sony coming in and also Oliver Wade, who
Yes.
was who I've worked with actually at a couple other places since then, helping kind of like massage that story and doing the art. So it became kind of a team effort as far as like building that out. But with a reduced team size and, coming off of sack crunch going, or sorry, size matters crunch going right into sack crunch, quality was starting to kind of
Yeah.
wane quite a bit on these projects. Like you can only push a team, for so long and so hard and expect good results. But we were on that grind. We had to keep knocking out title after title.
Yeah.
Keep the money coming in for the company. And but I was proud of like a lot of things we did in that. Like we had some pretty funny gags. I think I mentioned on one of your streams where I really didn't like the original Ratchet and Clank menu systems where you had a gadget one and then you had a weapon one. It felt like there
Yep.
was just too much switching between them. So I made kind of the decision to merge gadgets into weapons and vice versa. So you'd only have to deal with like one menu system, and then it would work, in very context specific ways to like gum up the works of gear so you can get past them, or throw a tango vine at it. I mean, have it eat them on the spot. So it now had this kind of neat dual use that I thought was really cool, and I was quite proud of.
There's a lot of stuff in both Size Matters and Secret Agent Clank that I really, really enjoy conceptually, that you can tell just needed more time
Yeah.
to come out. And that's not a commentary on anything quality wise. It's just like, I love the idea of contextual weapons as gadgets, and I love the idea of even like there was so much charm in the replay system in Secret Agent Clank, because they all had timelines, where somebody on the team had written like, oh, this was 2 days ago, this happened, and we have a whole description of what happened. And that was the first time there was a proper replay system in a Ratchet game. B, the weapon mods in that game for Ratchet's weapons started changing the name and properties of the weapons fully, instead of just being a lock on or an acid thing. There were a lot
Hmm.
of really, really, really cool things that sadly got bogged down by you guys being so tight on time. And then partway through Clank is when Lost Frontier would have come into play as well, probably around the time that the Microsoft project was canceled, I'm guessing.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, we trudged through. Well, the same team that was doing SAC rolled right on to Lost Frontier.
Okay,
Um, so it was the same team. Like they weren't overlapping in any
gotcha.
real way.
Okay, okay.
Um, but also at this point too, there were some tensions happening in the studio, and then Leslie left. Um, I think halfway through SAC, even though she wasn't on that project. So, I was still doing that project, but her leaving was like a major blow to the company because she had a really good relationship with Sony. She was an excellent producer and kept, all the trains relatively running on time.
Yeah,
And I say relatively given it's Hig. So with her loss, like things definitely started to slip through the cracks quite a bit. And losing staff in the middle of development cycle, even if they're not on your project, doesn't bode well for morale.
yeah.
Yeah, and kinda going back to our talking about, catering dinners, we were now getting catered dinners, but, it was pizza every single night from a place called Big Mama's Pizza. It's not only are we not sleeping much, but now we're just eating
Just
greased
grease.
cheese
Yep.
and bread, like,
Yep.
24/7. It was
Oh
awful.
god. That sounds
It wasn't all
horrendous.
the meals, but it was starting to become the majority of that. Like, I'm
Yeah.
sure people will have PTSD looking back and thinking about the Big Mama's Pizza if any of the Higgs listen to this particular interview. And, I wanna put in the caveat, like, this is from my point of view
Of
of
course.
working on the project. I'm sure everybody else has a separate one and what their experience was on that project. But, yeah, so Secret Agent Clank, it was me leading a small team of fairly green people. There was one insom, named Ken, who was mainly a programmer. I'm starting to trip on my words now. We've
No,
been
no, you're
talking
good.
so long.
You're good.
Um, there was an insomniac named Ken who was a programmer there, but he also does a little bit of game design. And he helped out doing like a lot of the lore and designing, unfortunately, a lot of the more difficult levels. He was a really good programmer, but his game design leaned
His enemy
very
placements.
difficult with
Yeah.
hoverboards from the original game. A lot
Oh,
of the long rhythm sections in SAC, things like that, like the Impossible card game where you're playing
so it's
there.
so it's his fault.
He did some good stuff. He had some very clever Gadgetbot type stuff too, that he peppered in there. But it's tough to do your best work when you're doing double duty as a
Yeah,
programmer and a designer.
of course.
So, and that also showed. Um, and as we're crunching, things are slipping between the cracks, and things are getting missed here and there.
Mhm.
Uh, but looking at the first project, I'm sure on Size Matters, he knows that Slim Cognito doesn't talk. In that we forgot to record his VO lines for that one. So this time around, I'm just like, I'm not going to make this mistake. So I
Yeah.
make sure I got all his lines for Secret Agent Clank and baked him into the story. Um, but my hubris got the best of me because I forgot one major component in Secret Agent Clank. I helped write the Quark opera, which is very infamous to this day,
Yes. Yep.
along with a couple of the other guys at the studio, and we brought in Jim Ward to do the VO. And I had forgot to tell him that it is to be sung in opera. And he came in and looks at it, and one of the Sony guys is just like, "Hey, did you tell him it's going to be an opera?" And I'm just like, my heart just dropped.
Oh,
I'm just like, oh, like I just about crapped myself. And so I kind of sheepishly go, "Hey, can you sing opera?" And Jim looks at me and goes, "Huh, hold on." And he looks at the script, reads over it, and he goes, "All right, start recording." And he belts it out as an opera and gets the entire thing in almost one go.
wow.
And it was fantastic. And I was just like, I am saved. I am saved. I will sweep this under the carpet until an interview, 20 years later or whatever.
That's incredible. I'm assuming that was you meant told me to ask about a Jim Ward story, and I had just written that down. I'm assuming
That
that
was the
was
that
the
was the Jim
okay.
Ward story.
That's
He
incredible.
turns out we totally screwed up, didn't tell him it was a
Yeah.
song and more importantly opera, and turns out the man can sing opera and quite well.
That's incredible. That's so cool. There were a couple things I wanted to ask, and they're going to bounce between Size Matters and Secret Agent Clank
Yeah.
at this point. Um, one was, and this is a small one. Do you have any recollection of the Ratchet and Clank Java mobile games ever being brought up within the studio during Size Matters?
I don't.
Okay. The only reason I
Can you
ask,
expand upon that a little bit, just out
sure.
of curiosity? Maybe it'll
So
jog my memory.
there were two Java games that were being made because Sony was investing in the that market at the time as well. And one was called Going Mobile, which did come out. There was another one called Clone Home, which did come out, but it only came out for 2 weeks in by one Canadian phone telecom company on their storefront, and then it got pulled, and it's never been released since. And the reason I ask is that the common explanation is that Size Matters had a similar clone-based story, sort of, and
Interesting.
that was the excuse given because they were both supposed to be out in '07.
I have heard of both the titles,
Okay.
for
I'm
sure.
sure you've been asked
I
by people
don't
before.
recall it ever squashing another title, though. That's interesting.
It
Being on a different SKU, I wouldn't imagine that would happen, and with us being separated from,
mhm.
Insomniac,
And it wasn't even
I don't know.
Insomniac, it was a Java it was an external Java developer, 2 of them actually, technically.
Oh,
Um
I guess what I'm going with is, like,
oh, I'm sorry.
Insomniac could put down the foot and say, "No, they got a very similar storyline, you need to put the kibosh on this, Sony."
Yeah,
And I don't think Hig had that kind of pull.
yeah.
So, you know, maybe, maybe not. I honestly couldn't tell you for sure.
It's it's an
It doesn't
interesting one.
sound right, though.
Yeah, I like it's one of those where I think it just my understanding because I covered the first mobile game and I then put together a theory which apparently ended up being correct as to they had one Java developer named Java Ground who developed the first game and like some of the Spider-Man games that they had
Mhm.
done. Every game after the first Ratchet mobile game was made by a different Java developer. And so my theory was that a different studio came in and made it because I had reached out to one of the developers of the Java game and they had said, "Yeah, we never actually worked on it. We saw a couple screenshots of it or something like that." And so somebody found like a fan went and found based on my theory somebody who has a mobile phone with the game on it still and I've been trying to get in touch with them because we have somebody who has a dumping software to get it preserved. But it does
Right.
exist, and anyway, it's a long story to say that the thing did exist. It did come out. It was made by a different team, but the excuse was always that it was quietly canceled because of Size Matters having a similar plot, which doesn't make sense.
No, I think that's a stretch.
Yeah,
Now that you're kinda describing it, if
yeah,
it was a game about shrinking, then yes, because that was, like, the whole premise and,
yeah,
meat of what Size Matters was, sure. The cloning didn't even really come in until the end,
yeah.
and it was such a minor bit that I would find it very difficult to believe that they just said, "No, you can't reuse this
Yeah.
cloning thing."
There was some shrinking in the first one, I think, so there might have been planned for the second one. It's one of my goals is to try and get that saved and preserved somehow, just to see, because it's not gonna
Huh,
be a good game, don't get me wrong, like, the first game was, like it was really good for a Java game, but
yeah.
it's a Java game, you're playing on a keypad. Um, but anyway, that was just a vanity question. The question I was then going to ask is, I know you had mentioned in Size Matters when I had done the stream of the PS5 game, the bot arena being a thing that was requested very late. Is that am I remembering that correctly?
You are remembering that correctly. So a very common thing in video games is usually late in development. I hate to say it. The publisher will play through the game and realize the length of the game,
Hmm.
and they really like putting on the box 60 plus hours of gameplay.
Never
And
changed either.
nope. And so they did this on Vigilante 8. Like they came in like the last couple months and say, "Hey, can you put some mission modes in there because purely arena, based fighting is not enough." And we scrambled, and that's a whole different story, to shove that stuff in at the last second to pad out the playtime of
Yeah.
V8. We did the exact same thing with Size Matters. They came in, and also it happened again on SAC too, where they came in and just say, "Hey, we need X amount more gameplay hours in here. What can you do?" So we created like a lot of little side missions using spare parts from different parts of the game that weren't used, kind of like the Mungo blow up thing. And so there was a bunch of vehicles that Clank was originally supposed to fly around in, and
Hmm.
that section got cut.
Yeah.
So I ended up using those pieces to build the demolition Clank challenges, where he's now placed in little vehicles he
Yeah.
flies around in, and so are the enemies. The bot flinger was another one. Um, if you remember the end boss with the two giant hammer fists,
Yep.
that was cut art that was not going to make it into the game until I was just
Huh.
like, "Hey, you're going to use that?" And they're like, "No, we can't think of a thing to do with it." And it's like, "Okay." I'll take those Clank ships. I'll take that robot you're not going to use, and I will make a challenge out of it. And the same team that did the multiplayer were the same three guys that we kind of threw together all these extra missions just to pad things out
Yeah,
to buy more gameplay time.
you could never escape vehicle demolition by this point in your
It,
career.
it seems to be my bread and
Yeah.
butter. My God,
What
I
was
think
there?
I've worked on.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I think I worked on like one, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight, nine, 10, probably about 12 cart slash vehicle combat type games, including the cut. Actually, is relevant to here. The cut Crash Team Racing 2010 that I worked on for High Impact Games
Oh
that
yeah.
got canceled because the property was tied into called Crash Landing, which I think was made by, oh God, I forget. It was a Canadian studio. I forget, but they went under because they were unable to kind of meet the deadlines, and as a result, the version I was working on for Hig, which was the last thing I did for them, got cut. But it was a spectacular vertical slice. You can find videos of it online,
Those came out
and it's
a few years back, I think. Those were like
yeah,
we knew that there was a Crash game that you guys had worked on, but it had only come out relatively recently that it was a Crash Team Racing prototype.
it was Crash Team Racing. I can send you some of the YouTube videos on it if you want to check it out. But it was really neat. You could drive on different surfaces. You could customize your cart to be like octopus wheels and drive on walls, or get like a frog engine and jump into secret areas. And actually, I took all of those ideas from V8 Second Offense, where the tires swap out into like hover and skis, and just extended that into this Crash Team
That's
Racing
so
game.
cool.
So it all kind of connects.
Yeah.
And there's a working theory too that when I was showing off Second Offense, that the Nintendo guys from Mario Kart came through and were checking out the game. And I've always theorized that they got the tire swapping on the
The
Mario Kart
anti-gravity.
8,
Yeah.
all that stuff from Vigilante 8 Second Offense.
They
I
they
could
would
be wrong.
they would never admit it because there was a funny one where it was with Ratchet 2 that they had the globe levels, the ones where you run like the sphere.
Mhm.
That was years before Mario Galaxy, and someone mentioned it to Miyamoto at one point in an interview, and he's like, "I don't even know what Ratchet and Clank is." So even if it was a thing that he took from, you would never admit it.
Yeah,
Not that it was him.
so
Yeah.
Activision actually, we had a school bus that people would go in and they played versions of the game, and a group of Japanese businessmen came through, and after I kind of demoed the game to them and they left, one of the Activision people came over and said, "Those are the Nintendo guys," and I was like, "No way! I got to show off my game to Nintendo," and then
Oh,
just
it's
like
cool.
years later, I'm just like, I think I know where
Those
you got your tire
bastards.
from.
Oh, that's great. Um, I was gonna ask related to that sort of change and difficulty tuning with regards to size matters, which I know you wouldn't have had a direct hand in. How
Oh, I
much?
did.
Oh, you did. Okay. Do you want?
I
I'll let you elaborate
did.
on that before I ask the question.
Yeah, dynamic difficulty tuning, right?
Yeah,
Where
yeah.
we're going. Yeah, so this has been something in the Ratchet games for a while that nobody knew about. And when I even back in the day, like I talked to them and I thought this was genius because they would do dynamic difficulty tuning where they'd make the game easier for players who would die over and over again, but they would do it in an invisible way
Yeah.
in which the player could not put their finger on and say, "Hey, why are the damage numbers not as high as they were before? Why is my health not going down as much? Why are enemies doing less damage?" Because they didn't want the player to feel like the game was getting easier.
Yeah.
They didn't want to, they felt that was going to frustrate players, but they also didn't want to bottleneck in the game where you're playing up the section you just can't get past it, and you're just going to put the game down and walk
Yeah.
away and play something else. So they put in this invisible dynamic difficulty tuning where enemies will idle more, they'll run the cover more, they'll take longer between firing shots, but the damage is never adjusted in a way that you can put your finger on it. So that plus the ability you get to keep your bolts when you die. So
Mhm.
you're constantly
Yeah.
getting stronger with each death until you eventually overcome this. And then if you don't die for a while, it ratchets back up to the base level. And that was kind of the ratchet difficulty level. I took it beyond that on Size Matters. Leslie gave me the task to do it. She told me how they did it in the past, which is how I knew about, ratcheting it down. No pun intended. But I said, what if you're in a state of flow that's better than the baseline? So I actually had the game ratchet up the difficulty the better you did, up to a point where the enemies would become harder. They would shoot more often. They would be more aggressive and in your face to give really skilled players more of a challenge on that game. So, and then if you continue to die, then it would ratchet back down,
Yeah.
and eventually it would find kind of the perfect level of your skill level to keep you in the flow state. Intended to
Yeah.
easier levels.
That's so A, that's always been fascinating to me because I know the earliest was actually Spyro 3 was the first game they started testing with that for,
Mhm,
which is an interesting piece of trivia. My question is related to that and also the general difficulty of the game, both in terms of general game balance, new game plus balance, economy, etc. Because Size Matters got criticized a lot of the time by fans for its weaker weapons relative to what you'd expect, especially later game, as along with the economy making it a little bit harder to get weapons for New Game Plus, and essentially forcing you to take a third playthrough to get through everything at the very least. And the reason I say all that is I'm curious how much time you guys had when going right from Size Matters to Secret Agent Clank to account for reviewer feedback, player feedback, focus test feedback that you couldn't implement, stuff
mhm.
like that, because one of Clank's struggles is still very similar.
Yeah, I didn't do any of the new game plus
Mhm.
tuning along those lines. I think that was probably Leslie, and some of the other Insom guys. The weaker weapons, if I remember right, was the fact that we couldn't have as many enemies on screen
Mhm.
as you would have in previous Ratchet games, and if the weapons were too powerful, you would just blast through them, and it wouldn't feel very challenging.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, it did make the weapons feel less powerful as a result of it, because we could only have like 4 or 5 enemies on screen at a time, as opposed to like a Ratchet game where you can have like 2 or 3 times that. So you want a more
Yeah.
powerful weapon to like blast through them at an even pace. So I think that was one of the reasons why the weapons were weaker. Um, and I did a lot of the weapon stuff, mostly the mods and upgrades at that point.
Yeah.
So I thought that I was doing a good amount of tuning on that and making them in line with some of the Ratchet stuff, with that caveat that we did have less enemies and we wanted combat to take a little bit longer,
Yeah.
because kind of going back to that playtime thing, if we had fully powered Ratchet weapons, I'd probably be making a dozen more Clank challenges to make up for the
Yeah.
fact that we could blast through these
I'm
enemies
glad we
so
got
much.
it the way we did at the very least. Yeah, that makes sense. Especially with regards to what you're saying with the mods, because the mods always felt like they did more for the weapons than leveling them up did in Size Matters, as
Mm,
well as in Clank. Although with Clank, it's a lot harder for me to really gauge as a player, just because there was so much variety there to try and like get that playtime through and kind of experiment, that you don't really have a lot of time to really get an idea of what the weapons, do damage wise, especially with
mhm.
Clank. Less so with Ratchet, because those are all together in like an arena section. Whereas with Clank, you might not play as Clank properly for like 40 minutes, 50 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah, the weapon system, I mean, obviously I've done lots of weapon stuff, so all the weapons and mods pretty much fell on me, except for a bunch of the initial base weapons that were already built for Size Matters. So, but I got to go in and make a bunch of interesting mods for it to kind of juice them up and make them more powerful.
Yeah.
The one weapon I did get to create from scratch was the sniper mine. And
Yeah.
while interviewing, for high impact games, I was looking at Deadlock, and I saw a lot of complaints about people being able to run around and hip snipe, using basically a super powered weapon without the scope. So I decided to go in and try to fix that as one of my duties, and I made the damage be tied to the zoom of the weapon. So if you run around and you just hip snipe, it's at the lowest zoom, which means it hardly does any damage. But if
Yeah.
you can zoom it all the way out, it is probably one of the strongest weapons in the game at that point, especially fully leveled up.
Yeah.
So
Uh,
that, and then a couple of the other mods like the bee mines poisoning and stuff like that. So
mhm.
I tried to make very interesting mods when I was building out a lot of this stuff.
And a lot of it makes sense in the sense like even you mentioning the game time issue. Like that explains like the acid bomb glove, for example, because that's not a very conventionally strong weapon to the point that it's going to be underleveled by the time you beat the game for most players.
Mhm.
I would venture to say, because you have to get one of the mods to actually make it do pretty much anything. Um, like that's not shade. It's just like it doesn't do a lot of damage. So after level one, it only kills the smallest enemies fast enough
Yeah.
for one bomb. So it falls behind, and then it gets really powerful. Later playthroughs. Um,
Yeah, I have a feeling the power curve was probably me because the acid glove was already in place when I got
mhm.
there, and I think I added the epoxy and
And those are what
the
made it
burn to
good.
it,
Those are what made it
which
good. It's
juiced it up.
it's such an interesting thing because like you could tell that even prior to your arrival, they were trying to get more creative with the idea of the weapons, going back to the style of Ratchet 1, which is something I've always admired, even if it
Mhm.
didn't necessarily work for a traditional Ratchet game. Funny side thing for the sniper, they Insomniac later did something similar with the sniper in the Crack in Time, the third PS3 game. They didn't increase damage based on zoom. They increased damage based on when you zoomed. There were specific hit points that had like a critical damage to it, so that it forced you to
Uh,
zoom. That game didn't have multiplayer, so it didn't actually matter. But it's an interesting like there were two different similar solutions to that problem that came up over the years.
yeah, yeah, that's interesting. I also heard that they incorporated our armor system that's in one of the games in the future too.
The most recent game sort of did. So what they did was you can mix and match your armor pieces. Your armor has a static amount of damage reduction that it does.
Mhm.
By unlocking new pieces of armor, because they made armor pieces a collectible like in Size Matters, that would give you save file wide buffs to specific qualities. So it could be
Interesting.
like there because in the most recent game there were three types of enemies. There were like pirates, robots, and organic enemies.
Mhm.
And so there would be a percentage damage buff as you got certain pieces of armor to do more to those types of enemies or get 15% more bolts, 15% more experience, that sort of thing. Um, definitely taken in the spirit of Size Matters, which is one of the cooler things about that game because I think I really
Mhm.
like the idea of Size Matters armor system. And to my difficulty tuning question, that's another interesting one because once you get to New Game Plus, if you don't wear the best armor, you're dead in one hit. Um,
Yeah.
but to circle back to the feedback question, how did you guys have what you would feel would be ample time to kind of respond to things as you were seeing them, or was it just because you were so crunched up, you kind of just had to go on Clank?
We were pretty crunched up and we had kind of just had to go.
That's what I figured.
We got Size Matters out the door with a relatively new and unproven team. I know a lot of shade is thrown at Hig and Size Matters, but anytime, even if you're pulling people from another studio like the Insomniacs, it if you're in a new studio, it's a new culture,
Yep.
it's new people, it's new workflow. It's never going to be the same or as good as the old groups that were able to like build this foundation and know all the ins and outs of these projects. Like even the North Carolina studio, which I think did like what All for One.
All for One and the two following games, and then
Yeah,
now they're kind of now remote work exists, so now they can
yeah.
co-develop more.
Even those don't feel like or didn't initially feel like classic
Yeah,
Ratchet and Clank games, but that put aside with all the growing pains of Hig, we were pretty proud of what we did, and it did some pretty good numbers. Granted, it's because we were eventually bundled with the PS1 that
The PSP,
that
yeah.
helped quite a bit.
Yeah. It
Um,
it was the
oh yeah,
highest
sorry,
selling. No,
PSP.
no, no, you're okay. It was the highest selling Ratchet game up until the PS4 one, which, to be fair to that one, was like $20 for a long time.
Yeah,
So it's
yeah.
I think it's either still the second highest, or by this point the PS5 game, depending on how sales have grown, may have been able to overtake it. It'd be close. Um
Yeah, and it was a pretty successful game for Sony too. I think there was even talks or desires that hopefully would get purchased by them and
mhm,
become an internal studio, but unfortunately that started to unravel after SAC quite a bit.
yeah.
But going back to like being able to absorb feedback after you know, Size Matters wrapped, pretty much the entire team just went off on vacation
Mhm,
for like a month. And then when you return to studio, a couple weeks to a month, return to studio, deals are already in place, and then we're just off and running
yeah.
again. And I do remember that Secret Agent Clank was a pretty aggressive timeline for what they wanted. So we were looking at what could we reuse from Size Matters. And then that's when we actually pulled in Ratchet into the arenas, so that we could reuse him and a lot of the weapon tech
Yeah.
there to kind of get us extra gameplay. Somewhere along the lines, Sony wanted Quark to be in the game, and now we have three types of gameplay coming in, and that, along with reduced team size, started to become
Yeah.
a bit of a disaster.
And then the Gadgetbots
And
came into play, and then
Gadgetbots came into play,
all the
though I love
side
them.
the vehicles and all that stuff.
Yeah, yeah, and I probably, this is on me. I probably created too much varied gameplay for Quark, and you don't want to do that when you have this. You're putting this much into a game. You don't want one offs, and I
Yeah.
think I may have created a lot of one offs there.
And Quirk wasn't
Um,
super distinct a lot of the time. I'll give you credit. Like there were, I'm sure from your perspective, I'm sure like the back end was very different from what you guys were doing. But Quark was never one of my critiques of it. I'll speak personally. Uh, Besides the fact that he didn't have any direct, engagement to like a feedback loop, because he was just
mhm.
kind of he doesn't have any. He has his one weapon. He has no upgradable nanotech like Ratchet and Clank do. Um, no what that's pretty much it. Just no weapons and no like he kind of separated from the mechanics in a way, uh,
Yeah,
while also not being an arena or challenge based thing like the Gadgetbots or like the vehicles. He was just kind of. It makes sense that it was. You could tell that's a Sony directive. Like that was one that even when I played as a kid, I was like, someone asked for that.
yeah, and there was actually hopes too of spinning this off into a Quark only game after
Yeah,
Secret Agent Clank, but Secret Agent Clank didn't do as well as everybody hoped. So the team worked on that. I think Ken did mostly like the Gadgetbot sections, even though I came up with like a lot of the story and gags that were put into that game. Like the Gadgetbots having a painted on tuxedo was one of my favorite things I put in there. Or Clunk with the evil Spock magnet
yeah,
beard was another one of mine, which I was pretty proud of. But mainly on this project, I was handling all the weapons, or most of the weapon systems. I think the plasma whip was one that one of the programmers wanted to do, and did it with passion. Like they crunched because they wanted to make that because it was technically impressive
yeah,
for what we were doing with the PSP. And then I handled all the Ratchet Arena sections. And this one's kind of a funny story because I looked at a bunch of old prison movies and kind of things you would expect in a comedy around that. And I eventually introduced the shower section into that, and I had all the enemies in there naked with towels on, taking a shower. And one of the first builds we did was if you took damage, Ratchet's towel would come off, and obviously there's just nothing there. He was smooth like a Ken doll.
yeah.
And Sony producer came back and said, "Hey, this is really funny, but we can't do this. Rule number one is you cannot have Ratchet be naked." And I was like, "What?" And I was like, "But this is hilarious. I don't want to cut all this stuff. Like we're having like a bunch of mini challenges in the shower scene, with some great gags." So we went back and forth, and I said, "Let me think about it before we do any knee jerk reactions." And I talked to the programmers, and we came up with an idea of having a black camera facing bar, down in his
Yep.
nether regions, and we also did that for all the enemies. And then we even spun that into another challenge with the
Don't get
paparazzis
hit.
taking
Yep.
pictures of you naked.
Yep.
And so Sony let it slide that time, but they were not happy initially about
That would have been
about
a
making
risk in a post hot coffee mod world as well, because if there's any situation where
Oh,
someone can no clip that black bar out, that game's getting pulled. Because the
that's
ESRB
right.
like that like it's an interesting thing to look back on because I you can see I'm surprised they weren't more cautious about any like A bugs on that, unless they were.
Maybe, I don't know. They seem satisfied with it.
Yeah,
Um, I mean,
not that there
obviously
wasn't
there's
anything there.
nothing there.
Yeah, yeah,
Like,
like it shouldn't matter, but
it shouldn't matter, but
um,
yes.
and that like the Ratchet Arena stuff is some of like the my favorite parts of that game because it's one of the most unique arenas that Ratchet has had.
Oh,
Um,
thanks.
like I really enjoyed a lot of the side like objectives. Like it's very you can tell it's very Iron Lombax esque in that it's not just an arena. You're trying to do something new with it. And again, same with the weapon mods. There's a lot of stuff in those games that I'm like, man, if they could find a way to implement that in a in a mainline Insomniac game, like there are so many cool things. And to be fair, some of them they
Mhm.
have, like a lot of the weapon upgradey moddy type things they have sort of done in their own way. Was it ever spoken of after Clank released on PSP? The fact that in New Game Plus, someone forgot a zero on two of the weapons upgraded versions.
Yeah, we found that too late.
It's
We honestly, that should have been on Sony. But these games are pretty big and
yeah,
pretty difficult in certain sections. I remember the Sony playtesters were ready to revolt on the hoverboards for size matters. God help them on Secret Agent Clank. Like we had some
yeah.
crazy hard sections, and it was really big. And playing through that thing in New Game Plus,
That's a it's
it
a
just got it
it's a
just got
wreck
missed.
sometimes.
Yeah, it just got missed. I mean, I'm sure you've heard the stories of like on size matters, and I think even well, actually, no, we were a little bit more proactive on SAC, but size matters. At the last minute, we kind of forgot to put the bolts in, and we just had an intern just go through and
Yes.
throw all the golden bolts
Yep.
everywhere, and that's why you see some really weird ones
Just see,
in
oh, it's
odd
over at a corner.
spots.
Yep.
Yeah, we try to be a little bit more generous with like Secret Agent Clank, like running through Rio. If you just happen to tilt the camera, you would see it down an
Yep.
alley or something like that. But it wasn't like a weird hover jump onto this thing and then back behind the building, and then you would see the bolt. We try to at least have them in view so you could kind of figure out how to get
Yeah.
there.
No, the weird ones were
That's
the key cards. That's where it was like we're gonna hide those things. But
oh
that was
yeah,
like one person's pet thing, right? That was
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I remember the key cards. I don't know if that was it was either Ron or Ken. Those I'm guessing Ken. Ken made the hardest. He made the hardest of hard things.
There's a running theme with
Uh,
that.
yeah, yeah. Nice guy though. But yeah, the key cards. I even forgot about that until recently. There's also we put to kind of make the holomodical cooler,
Yep.
we put little hidden patches in the environment where if you use it, you would see a little profile and collect them, but the profile would be about each of the game
Somebody.
devs
Yeah.
on there.
That was always a cool
And
thing.
I like that one quite a
Yeah.
bit. I was always trying to figure out how to give more uses to weapons and gadgets in that game.
I think the
Uh,
monocle doesn't exist until New Game Plus in that like you could
it
zoom
does.
in. Does it? Okay. Maybe I'm crazy.
Oh, oh, to see the patches, I think is New Game
Yeah.
Plus,
I think it's like
but
technically
for
a different gadget, but it's the same zoom feature.
yeah, it was the one where you could disguise yourself as other people
Oh,
was the
duh.
main part of it.
Yeah. I think
Yeah.
they did I think in practice it became a separate version of that gadget where that doesn't matter. That doesn't matter
Yeah,
at
it's been
all.
so long, I
It's
forgot
such a
myself.
pedantic thing to think about because I think it was technically the hot like there was the not VR glasses, but it was like it was a red filtered glasses set
Yeah,
instead of the holomonocle. But
yeah. But
um
we stuck so many weapons in there. We didn't plan all of it, and a couple weapons we were just like, "Oh crap! Like, where are we going to introduce this?"
mhm,
And because it was such a frantic design pace, usually you want to give a weapon, let them play around with it in a safe environment,
mhm,
challenge them, get them used to it, then introduce a new weapon. But we had made so many weapons, we were just like, here's a carnation, here's here's a gem, here's a
Yeah.
this, and it was too rushed as far as the pacing went. Like the carnation, the Tangle Night Vine carnation, which was one of my favorite inventions in that game. We didn't have a place for it. I'm just like, oh my god, how are we going to introduce this to the player? And I remember looking at one of the cinematics, and we had the jack of all trades, and he had a little flower on his shirt. And I said, "Can you make me a cutscene where Clank bumps into him and it falls on the ground, and then we can give them that weapon?" And that's like how I saved the introduction of that particular weapon there. But you'll notice immediately after was like the cufflink bombs.
Yeah.
So because we had to insert the carnation there, you immediately get the cufflink bomb without really being able to play with either one of them comfortably, which is just poor game design on my part. But I'll blame the rush of Secret Agent
Yeah.
Clank.
I don't think there's any
Um,
direct faults to anybody on the team for how the game turned out. You know.
yeah, yeah, I mean, definitely poor decisions were made. No game is perfect, and yes, I won't always blame crunch and everything, but always best decisions aren't made or things are forgotten.
Yeah.
You also notice like the cufflink bomb is the gem is upside down.
I've never noticed that. I
The point is up.
yeah.
Usually you see like a gem where it's flipped the other way. I saw that and I was just like, and I asked for it, but it was considered a low bug because it wasn't game breaking. We had
Yeah.
so much stuff to fix that it stayed in the
Oh,
game.
that sucks.
And to this day, I cringe when I see
Yeah,
it.
that sucks. So there's one the ink pen.
Yes.
So that was at some point also intended to be a weapon of some sort. Is that correct?
Yeah, we were gonna have it blind,
Okay.
people at one point. You shoot them in the face, they would wander around like they couldn't see you for a minute or 2.
That would have been cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a neat idea because I've always wondered why it had that's the only gadget that's ever had ammo. Uh because it
Mhm.
like that's the only one that's just a gadget as far as Clank's arsenal goes that I can recall right now, at least. Um that's interesting. That would have been really cool. 'Cause I think that there was some speculation at one point that it was like that would have been where the flamethrower was for some reason, and then it's like, no, that doesn't make sense. But
Yeah, there could have been. We played with a lot of ideas in
yeah,
this thing,
yeah.
you know?